she had children by her own father. The most inbred daughter in the Appalachian Mountains wasn't hidden in some far-off cave. She was locked in a rear room, barely old enough to bleed. On a windswept ridge above a churchless valley, a weathered homestead smolders with silence cold ashes in the hearth, muddy boots by the cot, and a cradle buried under hay. A root cellar, torn open by flood, reveals swaddled bones and a tin locket marked R.W. But it's the marriage record in the preacher's hand, scratched and rewritten, that makes the sheriff drop his lantern. How long can a man call himself a father while praying over his own bride? If you would like me to continue creating stories so that this history, which is not taught in schools, is not forgotten, please subscribe to this channel. Write in the comments where you are watching from. The morning fog clung to the ground like wet wool as Sheriff Burl McAteer nursed his chicory coffee on the post office stoop. The bitter brew did little to ward off the autumn chill that had crept into Pike County overnight. His worn brass buttons caught the weak light as he shifted his weight, favoring his good leg. The old wound from Cold Harbor always ached worse in this weather. The steady clip-clop of hooves drew his attention to the north road. Through the thinning mist, Amos Ledbetter emerged, leading a laden mule by its reins. Something about the trader's hurried pace made McAteer set down his tin cup. "Sheriff," Ledbetter called out, his voice carrying an edge that cut through the morning quiet. "Found this one wandering near Cane Fork. No rider in sight." McAteer descended the wooden steps, his boots creaking on each tread. As he drew closer, the metallic smell hit him first. Blood, old but distinct, darkening the mule's halter. The saddlebags had been slashed open, their contents missing. A brass tag affixed to the bridle caught the rising sun. "Dent, Grundy." "Harlan Dent?" McAteer asked, running his fingers along the torn leather. "The peddler who works the western route?" "Same one," Ledbetter confirmed, passing over the reins. "Saw him 3 days past in Grundy, loading up with calico and kettles for the Prestonsburg market day." The sheriff circled the animal slowly, noting how the mud caked on its hooves had long since dried. The mule's coat was matted with burrs and leaves. It had been wandering for some time. In the saddlebag's remaining shreds, McAteer found a water-stained ledger. The last entry, written in neat columns, listed stops along the Big Sandy: Grundy, Elkhorn City, Thistlebone Ridge, Prestonsburg. "Thistlebone," McAteer muttered, his finger tracing the ink. "That's Whitaker's place." "Jebediah Whitaker?" Ledbetter shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't been down to market in months. Him and that girl of his keep to themselves up there." McAteer pulled out his own notebook, the pages yellow with age. The morning sun had burned away, enough fog to illuminate his writing. October 9, 1874. Dent's mule recovered near Cane Fork. Signs of violence. Nobody found. "Gather some men," he told Ledbetter, pocketing the notebook. "We'll need to search the riverbanks before the next rain comes." He paused, studying the mule's vacant eyes. "And send word to Prestonsburg. See if Dent made it there after all." The animal nickered softly as McAteer led it toward the hitching post. Something rattled in one of the remaining saddlebags. A single copper kettle, dented but intact. The sheriff reached inside and withdrew it, turning it over in his hands. A price tag still dangled from the handle. $3, Mrs. Whitaker." McAteer's fingers traced the torn edge of the tag. No one in the county had referred to a Mrs. Whitaker since Jebediah's wife died 6 years ago. He tucked the kettle under his arm and tied the mule securely, his mind already mapping the day's ride to Thistlebone Ridge. The morning bell tolled from the Presbyterian church, its sound muffled by the lingering mist. 6 dull rings echoed across Elkhorn City as Sheriff McAteer climbed the post office steps to retrieve his cooling coffee. The cup's contents had settled into a dark mirror, reflecting the grey October sky above. 5 days, you say? Sheriff McAteer pressed Ledbetter as they saddled their horses behind the post office. The morning had warmed enough to burn off the fog, revealing a pale blue autumn sky. Saw him loading his mule in Grundy last Friday, Ledbetter confirmed, checking his cinch. Said he was headed to Prestonsburg for market day. Would have passed Thistlebone Ridge on the way. Within the hour, McAteer had assembled a search party of 6 men, including Deputy Wade Collins and 2 local trappers who knew every bend in the Big Sandy. They split into pairs, working their way along the muddy trade road that wound through the hills. The October sun tracked overhead as they combed the riverbanks and creek crossings. McAteer's leg ached from hours in the saddle, but he pressed on, scanning the ground for any sign of the missing peddler. By nightfall they'd covered 10 miles with nothing to show but wet boots and tired horses. Dawn broke grey and cold the next morning as they resumed the search. Near Copper Creek Crossing, Deputy Collins called out, holding up a mud-caked leather heel from a man's boot. McAteer examined it closely, good quality work. The kind a successful peddler might wear, but it could have been lost weeks ago. Weather's turning, Collins observed, eyeing the heavy clouds building over Pine Mountain. Won't be able to track much once the rain starts. McAteer nodded, pulling out dense water-stained ledger. He traced the peddler's route with his finger. Grundy, Elkhorn City, Thistlebone Ridge, Prestonsburg. The Whitaker place was just another stop among dozens. Jebediah Whitaker might be odd, keeping to himself up on that ridge, but he'd never caused trouble. Call it off, McAteer ordered finally. Ground's too wet to hold tracks, and we're losing daylight. Sometimes the hills just take people. Back in Elkhorn City, he opened the county sheriff's log, its leather binding cracked with age. Under October 14th, he wrote in his precise hand, "Search, suspended for H. Dent, peddler. No body recovered. Likely foul weather misadventure on mountain roads. Property recovered. 1 mule, damaged saddlebags, partial ledger." 3 days later, McAteer sat at his cabin desk, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof. The lamp cast yellow shadows as he reviewed the entry one final time. Through the window, the wind carried a rhythmic creaking, perhaps a loose gate or a rope against wood somewhere in town. He picked up Dent's ledger again, still damp from where they'd found it in the saddlebag. The final page held one last entry in the peddler's neat script. Calico to J.W., Thistlebone 6 yards, paid cash. Dr. Elam Reardon's horse picked its way carefully along the mud-slicked trail to Thistlebone Ridge. Frost had settled overnight, coating the dead leaves in brittle white, making the path treacherous. His medical bag, worn smooth from years of house calls, bounced against his thigh as the mare navigated around a fallen oak. The Whitaker homestead emerged from the morning mist, a 2-room log structure with a leaning chimney and moss-covered shake roof. Smoke threaded weakly from the stone stack, and a single candle flickered behind the clouded window glass. The dooryard showed signs of recent activity. Fresh, split wood, a half-full water bucket, boot prints in the mud leading to the privy. Reardon dismounted, his boots squishing in the cold earth. He'd treated most families in Pike County over the years, but the Whitakers had never called for his services. Sheriff McAteer's request for a welfare check seemed routine enough, just making sure all was well after that peddler's disappearance. He knocked 3 times on the warped door. From inside came the sound of a chair scraping and measured footsteps. Jebediah Whitaker filled the doorframe, tall and gaunt in his preacher's coat. His grey beard hung like Spanish moss, and his eyes seemed to take a moment to focus on his visitor. "Doctor," he said, voice flat as a Bible page. "We weren't expecting anyone." "Sheriff McAteer asked me to look in," Reardon explained, keeping his tone professionally neutral. Making rounds after that business with the missing peddler. How's your daughter faring? Ruthie's took sick with lung fever, Whitaker replied. Been 3 days now. Best not to disturb her rest. The smell hit Reardon as soon as he stepped inside. Tallow smoke from cheap candles, yes. But underneath that, something darker. Like meat gone bad in summer heat, or a root cellar after flooding. As a physician, I should examine her, Reardon insisted. Lung fever can turn serious if not properly treated. Whitaker's shoulders tensed, but he nodded stiffly. This way. Mind your voice, she's sleeping. The back room was dim, lit only by what filtered through a grimy window. Ruthie lay on a narrow bed, covered to her chin with a patchwork quilt. Her face was pale as creek stones, dark hair matted with sweat. She didn't stir when they entered. May I? Reardon asked, already moving toward the bed with his bag. Whitaker stepped with him, never more than an arm's length away. She's been coughing something fierce. Hardly keeps food down. Reardon pressed his fingers to Ruthie's wrist. Her pulse was steady, if weak. Her skin felt cool, not feverish. When he lifted her eyelid, the pupil contracted normally in the dim light. She made a small sound but didn't wake. How long has she been sleeping? He asked, noting the lack of a water cup or chamber pot near the bed. On and off, Whitaker answered vaguely. I read her psalms when she's awake. Reardon tried to draw back the quilt for a proper examination, but Whitaker's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. The pressure wasn't quite painful, but the message was clear. She needs her rest, Whitaker said softly. Perhaps you could return another day. Through the thin walls came the sound of wind in the trees, and somewhere, the creak of rope or timber shifting. That rotting smell seemed stronger now, though Reardon couldn't pinpoint its source. Of course, he said carefully, packing away his stethoscope. I'll note in my ledger that I stopped by. Jebediah gestured toward a rough-hewn chair near the hearth. Please, Doctor, warm yourself before heading back. His hospitality seemed practiced, like verses memorized from a well-worn Bible. Reardon settled into the chair, keeping his medical bag close. The front room was spare, but tidy a table with 3 chairs, though only one showed signs of use. A shelf held a few books, their spines cracked with age. Through the thin wall came muffled coughing, followed by what might have been whimpering. Should I check on her? Reardon asked, half rising. No need. Jebediah moved between him and the rear door. She gets upset with strangers. Here, he pulled a strip of dried meat from a cloth-wrapped bundle. Some deer from last season. The Lord provides. The jerky was tough and oddly sweet. Reardon chewed slowly, watching Jebediah's shadow play against the wall as he moved about the room. Behind the locked door, a shape passed before the curtained window, Ruthie's silhouette, hunched and unsteady. How long has she been ill? Reardon asked, accepting a threadbare blanket for his lap. Time's hard to reckon, Jebediah said, stoking the fire. Days blend when you're tending the sick, but she's in the Lord's hands. Reardon reached for his saddlebag, withdrawing a leather-bound volume. I keep records from the Presbyterian circuit, including christenings. Might help track when symptoms started. He leafed through the pages, finding the entry he'd noted earlier. Ah, Ruth Whitaker, baptized October 1862. Jebediah's hand stilled on the poker. Records can be wrong. Church records tend to be quite accurate, Reardon said carefully. Makes her 12 now, doesn't it? Nearly 13, Jebediah corrected quickly. Growing fast as winter wheat. Another bout of coughing came from the back room, this time with a distinct rattle. Reardon stood, medical instincts warring with the growing unease in his gut. Mr. Whitaker, as county physician, I really should. Best you go now, Doctor. Jebediah cut in softly. Weather's turning, and them trails get treacherous after dark. His tone was gentle, but left no room for argument. Reardon gathered his things, noting how Jebediah positioned himself between the rear door and the exit. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of rain. His mare stamped nervously as he mounted. "I'll return next week," he called back. To check her progress, Jebediah simply stood in the doorway, silent as a cemetery stone, until Reardon rode out of sight. That evening, in the quiet of his office above Elkhorn's general store, Reardon opened his physician's journal. The lamp threw dancing shadows across the page as he wrote, "Girl's condition, indeterminate. Possible abuse. Father exhibits control. No independent witness available." He closed the book just as the church bells struck 9. Through his window, he could see old Reverend Whitmore locking up after evening prayers, his lantern bobbing like a lost star in the gathering dark. The next morning, while sweeping behind the altar, Elder Thomas Burke found a scrap of calico wedged between the floorboards. The patterned red roses on faded blue matched exactly the bolt last recorded in Harlan Dent's inventory before he vanished. Midday sun filtered through grimy windows, casting weak light on Josiah Pike's oak desk as he sorted through a stack of wrinkled papers. The merchant's fingers, stained with ink, traced down columns of numbers in his ledger. Every few minutes, he'd pause to compare an entry with one of Harlan Dent's promissory notes, his frown deepening each time. $26.43, he muttered, scratching figures with his pen, plus the cost of them copper kettles he was bringing. He looked up at Mary Beth Conley, his shop girl, who stood arranging jars of preserved peaches on a shelf nearby. "Did Dent say exactly how many kettles he had for us?" Pike called out, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Mary Beth turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "6, Mr. Pike. All different sizes. Said they'd fetch good prices before winter preserving started." She hesitated, then added, "That was 2 weeks ago Tuesday, when he stopped to arrange the order." Pike made another notation, his pen scratching against the paper. The store was quiet, except for the lazy buzz of flies and the distant thump of horses' hooves on the dirt road outside. A few customers browsed the aisles, picking through bins of dried beans and examining bolts of fabric. "Shame about them kettles," Mary Beth continued, lowering her voice. "My cousin Sarah was counting on one for her wedding gifts. Speaking of..." She glanced around before stepping closer to Pike's desk. "You hear what Tom Whitaker said about what he saw up on Thistlebone?" Pike looked up sharply. "Tom Whitaker, Jebediah's nephew." "The very same. He was up there last week hunting rabbit. Said he saw something peculiar in their side yard." Mary Beth leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "A cradle, Mr. Pike. All dented up and half buried under hay, like someone tried hiding it quick-like." Pike set down his pen, leaving a black dot on the ledger. "A cradle? You sure about that?" "That's what Tom said. Said it looked store-bought too, not rough. Made like most folk have up there." She straightened up, adjusting her apron strings. "Thought it strange, seeing as how there's been no baby at the Whitaker place since Mrs. Whitaker passed." Pike pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, dating it carefully. "When exactly did Tom say he was up there?" "Thursday last. Same day that storm blew through." Mary Beth paused at the sound of the shop door opening. "Said the cradle was copper, colored, like them kettles Dent carried." Pike's hand stilled over the paper. He thought of Dent's last visit, how the peddler had mentioned taking the north road past Thistlebone Ridge, how he'd promised to return with those kettles and settle his accounts. The merchant opened his bottom drawer, pulling out Dent's final delivery receipt. There, at the bottom, was a hastily scrawled note. "North route, T-Bone Ridge, back by Wednesday latest." He looked up at Mary Beth, who was now helping a customer examine calico patterns. The midday sun had shifted, throwing long shadows across his desk of figures that would never be settled, debts that would never be paid. Through the shop window, he could see Sheriff McAteer's deputy tacking up another missing person notice on the post office wall. The paper fluttered in the autumn wind, Dent's name clearly visible, even from across the street. The autumn wind cut sharp across Thistlebone Ridge as Sheriff McAteer and Deputy Caleb Varnes guided their horses up the narrow trail. Dead leaves skittered across their path, and overhead, bare branches creaked against a pewter sky. The Whitaker homestead emerged from the trees, a weathered log structure with smoke threading from its stone chimney. "Mighty quiet," Varnes muttered, adjusting his gun belt as they dismounted. Before they reached the front door, it swung open. Jebediah Whitaker stood in the frame, tall and gaunt in his preacher's coat, a thin smile beneath his matted beard. "Sheriff McAteer," he said, his voice soft as creek water. "Twice in 1 week. The Lord does provide company." McAteer nodded stiffly. "Mr. Whitaker, need to ask some follow-up questions about that peddler passed through." Of course. Jebediah stepped aside, gesturing them in. "Please, warm yourselves. I've corn whiskey if you're amenable." The interior was dim, lit only by the hearth and a single window. A crude table held a Bible and 3 tin cups. McAteer noticed fresh scrubbing marks on the floorboards. "Ruthie about?" the sheriff asked, declining the offered whiskey. "Resting deep," Jebediah replied, pouring himself a measure. "Poor child's constitution, you understand. These mountain winters tax her greatly." Deputy Varnes moved to the window, peering out at the side yard. "That shed collapsed recent?" "Last week's storm," Jebediah said. "Haven't had chance to right it yet." McAteer followed Varnes outside. The shed's roof had indeed caved in, boards scattered across frozen mud. Beneath the wreckage, something darker showed through the curved edge of what looked like a burned crib. "Mind if we take a closer look?" McAteer asked, but was already moving forward. "Property's open to the law," Jebediah said from the doorway, sipping his whiskey. Varnes circled the shed's remains, boots crunching on frost-rimed splinters. He stopped at the back wall, still partially standing. "Sheriff?" McAteer joined him. There, nailed to the weathered boards, was a boot sole good leather, store-bought. The brand mark was clear. Curtis, Sons, Richmond. "Just scrap for kindling," Jebediah called out. "Folk up here can't waste much." McAteer's jaw tightened. The sole matched the description in Dent's effects inventory, down to the worn heel. But a boot wasn't a body, and suspicion wasn't grounds for a warrant. "Appreciate your time, Mr. Whitaker," McAteer said finally. "We'll be in touch if anything comes to light." The ride back to town was silent. At the sheriff's office, Varnes lit the oil lamp and opened Dent's sales ledger. There, under the last dated entry, was Ruthie's name, and across it, a faint brown smear that might have been mud, might have been something else entirely. McAteer watched the stain a long moment before turning to his deputy. "Ride over to the county clerk first thing tomorrow. Have him pull property deeds for Thistlebone Ridge." He paused, rubbing his torn earlobe. "And tell him to check records of any midwife visits up there. Last 3 years." Morning fog rolled thick across Grundy Township, turning the scattered houses into gray shapes that rose like stones from a clouded river. Sheriff McAteer hitched his horse outside Bethia Carter's 2-room shack, the worn planks dark with dew. His boots left prints in the frost-rimmed mud as he approached her door. Bethia Carter answered his knock before his hand fell a 3rd time. She stood broad-shouldered in her wool skirt and leather apron, her gray hair pulled severe against her skull. Her hawk-like eyes took his measure. "Sheriff McAteer," she said, neither greeting nor question. The leather apron's pockets bulged with her usual tools, salt packets, dried herbs, and what locals whispered were old coins for crossing palms. "Miss Carter," he removed his hat. "Need to ask about some records you might keep." She didn't move from the doorway. "Been retired 3 years. Don't attend births no more. Looking back some, actually. Thistlebone Ridge. Whitaker Place. Something flickered in her expression, quick as a candle guttering. She stepped aside, letting him enter a room that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. A pot of chicory coffee bubbled on the iron stove. "Sit," she commanded, moving to a corner where a heavy trunk sat beneath a window. The lock was well oiled despite its age. Her fingers worked the key with practiced ease. Inside, leather-bound ledgers lay stacked like cordwood. She pulled one marked 71, 72, set it on her scarred table. McAteer noticed her hands strong, calloused, spotted with age but steady as stone. "Paid in chickens mostly," she said, turning pages. "Some folk paid in corn, some in promises never kept." Her finger traced down columns of neat script, stopping suddenly. "Here, September 4th, 72. Thistlebone Ridge." McAteer leaned forward. The entry was brief. "Girl child. Silent. Paid 2 hens. No name given." "Remember anything particular about that visit?" he asked. Bethia's mouth tightened. "Remember everything particular about every visit, Sheriff. That's why I keep these." She tapped the ledger. "Memory outlives paper, but paper outlives argument." The girl Ruthie. She'd have been 10 then. "Too young," Bethia said flatly. "Far too young. But wasn't my place to question. Man of God, they said. Widower raising her alone." She paused, her fingers drumming once on the table. "Wouldn't let me clean her proper after. Rushed me out with those chickens before sunset." McAteer studied her face. "Any other visits up there?" She turned another page, then another. Stopped again. "December same year. Wasn't called. Just doing my rounds. Found the place empty. Smoke in the chimney, but no one home." Her voice hardened. "Heard crying from the root cellar. Jebediah came round the house before I could investigate. Said Ruthie had lung fever, wasn't to be disturbed. You believe that?" Bethia closed the ledger with deliberate care. "Believe lots of things, Sheriff. Believe some men who quote scripture hide devils under their tongues. Believe some silences speak louder than any mother's scream." She locked the trunk, the key vanishing into her apron. "Believe there's things even God's justice can't make right. Need to borrow that ledger, Miss Carter." She nodded once, handed it over. "Records true as I could make it. But there's things no book can hold." She walked to her door, opened it to the fog. 3 more winters I carried salt up that ridge. Never once heard birds singing near that house. Bethia Carter's hands trembled slightly as she pulled another ledger from the trunk, this one older. Its leather binding cracked and stained. The morning light filtering through her window had turned watery, casting long shadows across her kitchen table. "March 1872, she said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "That was the first time." She opened the book carefully, as if it might crumble under her touch. McAteer watched her weathered fingers trace the lines of faded ink. The room smelled of dried herbs and old paper, with an undertone of wood smoke from her dying stove fire, called out just past midnight. Bethia continued, her eyes fixed on the page. Moon was full, making the trail easier to follow. Jebediah met me at the creek, crossing with a lantern. She paused, swallowing hard. Should have known something wasn't right when he wouldn't let me ride ahead alone. The sheriff leaned forward, studying the careful script. March 15, 1872, Thistlebone Ridge. Live birth, girl, unnamed. Payment received. 4 hens, 1 pouch tobacco. Girl never made a sound, Bethia said, her fingers curling into fists on the table. Not during, not after. Just lay there with those sunken eyes, staring at nothing. Couldn't have been more than 10 years old. McAteer's jaw tightened. Jebediah was present, wouldn't leave the room, stood right beside her the whole time, hand on her shoulder. The spring thaw had torn away half of Thistlebone Ridge, leaving raw earth exposed like an open wound. Elijah Boone picked his way through the debris field, following deer tracks in the mud. His hunting dog, Scout, ranged ahead, nose working the disturbed ground where winter-killed saplings lay scattered like broken matches. The air hung thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. Boone's boots sank ankle-deep in places, the ground still soft from the melt. He'd been tracking a wounded buck since dawn, following a blood trail that led up the ridge's scarred face. Scout's bark turned to a whine. Boone found the dog standing rigid before a dark opening in the hillside, where the landslide had peeled away layers of soil to reveal a natural cave mouth. Thick roots dangled like hanged men's hair across the entrance. The smell hit him first sweet, sick, and ancient, like opened graves. "Back, Scout," Boone commanded, pulling his coal oil lamp from his pack. The flames sputtered in the damp air as he ducked under the roots. The cave wasn't deep, maybe 12 feet, but something wooden caught the lamplight. A crib, rough-built but solid, wedged sideways against the cave wall. Dirty rags spilled from its sides like stuffing from a burst pillow. Boone's hand shook as he lifted the lamp higher. The first bundle came apart in his hands. Tiny bones, yellow-white, tumbled onto the cave floor. A skull, no bigger than his palm, rolled against his boot. The second bundle held another, arranged with terrible care, small arms crossed over its chest. In the third, beneath black-spotted cloth, he found the locket tin, gone green with age. The initials, R.W., scratched into its face. Boone stumbled backward, nearly dropping his lamp. Scout's howl echoed off the ridge face as he scrambled onto his horse, not bothering to gather his trapline. The sun was setting by the time he reached Elkhorn City, his coat soaked through with cave damp and cold sweat. Sheriff McAteer assembled a party within the hour himself, Dr. Reardon and Deputy Varnes. They rode through twilight with lanterns swinging, following Boone's trail back to the cave mouth. The evidence lay exactly as Boone had described. 3 bundles, 3 sets of infant bones, the tin locket glinting dully in their lamplight. "There's more," Varnes called from deeper in the cave, his voice tight. The 4th bundle lay half buried in the back, wrapped in fresh calico. Blood had soaked through the fabric, still tacky to the touch. As Varnes unwrapped it, something metallic clinked against stone. Dr. Reardon held his lantern close. A gold ring caught the light, its inscription clear despite the cave mud. "To H.D. Harlan Dent," McAteer breathed, recognition darkening his face. He turned to Varnes. "Ride to the Whitaker place." Now, they found the house silent, the door unlatched. Ruthie lay alone in the back room, curled on a straw tick, her body racked with fever. Of Jebediah Whitaker, there was no sign. McAteer pulled paper from his coat pocket, hands steady as he wrote by lamplight. "Urgent dispatch. All counties. Suspect Jebediah Whitaker. Armed. Dangerous. Stop. Daughter secured. Stop. Murders confirmed. Stop." Grey mist clung to Linnefork Hollow like a death shroud, turning the skeletal trees into wavering specters. Samuel Wade trudged up the muddy path, his prospecting pan tucked under one arm, following the creek that wound through the hollow like a black snake. The spring thaw had exposed new coal seams in the hillsides, and Wade aimed to stake his claim before the larger mining operations moved in. The first thread of smoke caught his eye, just as the sun began burning through the fog. It rose thin and desperate from the chimney of Old Man Porter's abandoned coal shack, a derelict structure that hadn't seen use since before the war. Wade knew Porter had died 2 winters past. No one should be burning fires in that shack. His boots squished through the spring mud as he approached. The shack's door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and green moss crawled up its north wall. Inside, Someone had rekindled the pot-bellied stove. The warm, metallic smell of wood smoke mixed with something else, something raw and organic, that made Wade's stomach turn. "Hello?" he called out, one hand on the knife at his belt. "Anyone shelter here?" A baby's cry pierced the morning stillness, high and thin, like a wounded rabbit. Wade pushed the door open wider. The weak dawn light filtered through gaps in the roof boards, illuminating the scene in strips of gray. There, hunched in the corner on a bed of moldy straw, sat a gaunt figure in a preacher's coat. Jebediah Whitaker's hollow eyes reflected the dying embers in the stove as he cradled a squirming bundle against his chest. The newborn's face was purple-red, still crusted with birth blood. Dark ash from the man's hands had smeared across its skin. The umbilical cord, crudely cut, left a raw stump that stained the swaddling cloth, a piece of calico that Wade recognized from the missing peddler's inventory list on the reward posters. "She needs cleaning," Whitaker spoke softly, his voice rough from disuse. "Like her sisters needed cleaning, but the water's too cold now." He stroked the baby's cheek with one ash-blackened finger. "Too cold for washing away sins." Wade took a step backward, his heel catching on the threshold. The knife felt useless at his side. $15 reward money wasn't worth facing whatever darkness lived behind those empty eyes. But the baby let out another wail, weaker this time. "Mr. Whitaker," Wade said carefully, the way you'd speak to a cornered animal, "that child needs a doctor." "No doctors," Whitaker whispered. "No men of medicine. Only men of God can understand." He pulled the baby closer, rocking slightly. "She's the last one, the last chance to make it right." Blood had soaked through the calico, dripping onto the dirt floor. The baby's cries grew fainter. Wade's hands shook as he backed away from the door. The mist still hung thick enough to hide his retreat. He thought of the reward money, then of the tiny bones they'd found in the cave. His legs carried him down the hollow at a dead run, headed for the sheriff's station in Whitesburg. Behind him, the smoke continued to curl from the coal shack's chimney, and somewhere, in the gray morning, a baby's cry echoed once before falling silent. Sheriff McAteer and 6 deputies emerged from the fog-shrouded hollow, rifles trained on Jebediah Whitaker. The old man shuffled between them, hands bound with hemp rope, his preacher's coat hanging in tatters. He hadn't fought when they found him, just kept rocking that blood-stained bundle and reciting verses in a voice dry as autumn leaves. "The Lord giveth," he whispered now, over and over, "and the Lord taketh away." Deputy Varnes cradled the newborn, wrapped in his own clean wool coat. The infant's weak cries pierced the spring air as they approached the waiting wagon. "Doctor." Reardon met them at the crossroads, his medical bag already open. "Get her to Pikeville," McAteer ordered. "The women's clinic. Fast as you can drive." He watched the doctor and deputy disappear into the wagon with their tiny charge, then turned back to their prisoner. Whitaker stood peculiarly still in the mud, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the ridgeline. Weeks of hiding had hollowed his cheeks and matted his beard with cave dirt. The same red clay marked his boots and knees, the distinctive mud from Thistlebone's hidden caverns. "Where's Ruthie?" McAteer demanded, grabbing the old man's collar. "Where's the mother?" "Safe in the Lord's keeping," Whitaker murmured, "as all my children are kept." They found her that evening, after breaking down the homestead's cellar door. Ruthie lay curled on a rotting straw pallet, unresponsive to their calls. Fresh blood stained her dress. She didn't resist when Dr. Reardon's wife wrapped her in a clean blanket, didn't speak when they lifted her into the wagon. Her eyes remained fixed on the cellar's dark corners, as if watching shadows only she could see. In the Pikeville jail, McAteer slammed the iron door on Jebediah's cell with enough force to rattle the whole block. The old man sank onto his cot, still muttering psalms. His filthy boots left cave mud on the stone floor. The same red clay they'd found around those tiny skeletons. "Write it all down," McAteer told his clerk. "Charges of incest, concealment of death, abduction of Harlan Dent, and God knows what else we'll find." He pulled out his ledger, the same one where he'd dismissed Dent's disappearance months ago. Every detail, every date. "This time, we're doing it proper." The clerk nodded, dipping his pen. "What about the church records, Sheriff? Reverend Clay sent over that marriage certificate you asked for." McAteer unfolded the yellowed paper, squinting at the faded ink. There it was, dated 1870. Jebediah Whittaker listed as groom, and beside it, R. Whittaker, written in shaky script. The age was clearly marked, 18 years. Ruthie would have been 12, McAteer said quietly. He forged it, married his own daughter on paper to keep folks quiet. He tucked the document into his evidence pouch, trying not to think about what that marriage had really meant. Behind the cell bars, Jebediah's prayers grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. "Blessed be the name of the Lord, who gives and takes according to his will." McAteer turned away, unable to look at those empty eyes any longer. The evidence pouch felt heavy against his chest, each document inside marking another wound inflicted on an innocent child. Candlelight wavered across the worn pages of the church registry as Reverend Orrin Clay's trembling fingers traced the altered entries. Sheriff McAteer stood beside him, watching as the minister's face grew paler with each discovered falsification. "I should have seen it," Clay whispered, his voice thick with shame. "The Lord placed these records in my keeping, and I failed to protect their truth." The marriage registry lay open between them on the study's oak table, its leather binding cracked with age. McAteer pointed to an entry dated September 1870. The original ink showed through beneath crude scratch marks, Martha Whittaker's name partially visible under the overwritten Ruth W. "When did you first notice these changes?" McAteer asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the anger churning in his gut. Clay pulled his reading glasses from his nose, wiping them with shaking hands. I never checked the old entries. Jebediah was a founding member of our congregation. When he said he'd remarried, I took him at his word." He replaced his glasses, squinting at the altered page. "But look here, the paper's torn where he scraped away Martha's death date." McAteer leaned closer, studying the damaged page. The marriage entry listed Jebediah as 48, his bride as 18. But the sheriff had seen Ruthie's birth record. She'd been just 12 when this false marriage was recorded. "He came to you that September?" McAteer pressed. "What did he say exactly?" "Said he'd found a young wife from up Carter Creek way." Clay's voice cracked. "Asked me to record it quiet. Like, since her family didn't approve. I thought." He trailed off, horror dawning in his eyes. "Dear God, I never once questioned why she never came to services." The Reverend reached for another ledger, this one recording baptisms. His fingers found an entry from 1862. Ruth Ann Whittaker, infant daughter of Jebediah and Martha, baptized in the sight of our Lord. "The same girl," McAteer said quietly. "His own daughter." Clay slumped in his chair, the weight of his unwitting complicity visible in every line of his face. "I remember that baptism. Martha was so proud, holding little Ruthie in her white gown. She died just 4 years later. Consumption took her fast." McAteer pulled out his notebook, copying dates and details. "We need every altered record, Reverend. Birth registers, death notices, marriage lines, anything Jebediah might have changed to hide what he was doing." They worked through the evening, checking page after page by candlelight. Clay found more discrepancies. Attendance records showing Ruthie's absences growing longer each year. Donation logs noting Jebediah's offerings of fresh vegetables and eggs paid in silence. always alone. Here, Clay said suddenly, pointing to a smudged entry. Christmas service, 1872. I wrote that Jebediah came with wife and child. But I remember that night Ruthie was heavy with. He couldn't finish the sentence. McAteer carefully copied the entry, adding it to his growing list of evidence. The candle guttered, casting strange shadows across the damning documents. In the silence, church bells tolled the late hour, their somber echo carrying across the sleeping town. "I've been a fool," Clay whispered, closing the registry with trembling hands. "A blind, trusting fool." The sheriff gathered his notes, each page now filled with proof of Jebediah's methodical deception. "You weren't the only one, Reverend. But now we make it right." McAteer laid the marriage registry flat under the lamplight, pressing down the warped pages with careful fingers. The ink corrections stood out like wounds against the yellowed paper, dark slashes where Jebediah had tried to rewrite history. "Look here," Reverend Clay said, pointing to the crucial entry. His finger trembled above Martha Whitaker's scratched-out name. "The original ink shows through. See how he pressed too hard trying to cover it?" The sheriff nodded, studying the altered text. Where Martha's name had been, Ruth W., was written in a heavier hand, the strokes urgent and thick. The date beside it, September 14, 1870, seemed to mock them both. "That was Ruthie's 12th birthday," McAteer said quietly. "He made his daughter his wife the day she turned 12. Clay sank into his chair, hands clasped as if in prayer. "I remember that day. He came alone, said he needed to register a marriage. I trusted him. God help me. I trusted him without question." The sheriff pulled out a fresh sheet of foolscap. "Reverend, I need your sworn statement about this tampering. Every detail you can recall about when Jebediah brought this book to you. For the next hour." Clay dictated while McAteer's pen scratched across the paper. The minister's voice grew hoarse as he described how Jebediah had insisted on handling the registry himself, claiming his hands were steadier for writing. How he'd stood blocking Clay's view of the page, hunched over the book. When the statement was complete, McAteer called in the court scribe waiting outside. The young man worked methodically, copying every mark and alteration from the damaged registry page. His quill paused over the false marriage entry. "Make special note of the ink differences," McAteer instructed. "Judge Sipes will want to see exactly how the original text was obscured." The scribe nodded, adding detailed annotations about the different inks and scratch marks. When he finished, he sprinkled sand over the fresh copy to dry it, then sealed it in an envelope, marked for the circuit judge. "The summer session begins in 6 weeks, the scribe said, adding the date to the sealed packet. "Judge Sipes will want to hear this case first." As the scribe departed, Clay moved to his iron lockbox, its key hanging from a chain at his belt. He lifted the heavy registry with shaking hands, preparing to secure it until the trial. But as he turned the pages one final time, his breath caught. "Sheriff," he called, voice tight with alarm. "The next page, it's been torn out. Clean at the binding." McAteer hurried over. Where the page following the marriage entry should have been, only jagged edges remained. Clay began searching his desk frantically, shuffling through papers and books. The minister paused at his hymnal, noticing something protruding from its pages. He pulled out a sealed envelope, yellow with age. Inside was a single church record, dated 1872. "Infant female Whitaker, unblessed." The two men stared at the document, understanding its grim significance. Neither spoke as Clay added it to the lockbox with trembling fingers. The oak benches of the Pikeville courthouse groaned under the weight of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Summer heat trapped beneath the tin roof had turned the air thick as molasses, and handkerchiefs dabbed at glistening foreheads throughout the gallery. Sheriff McAteer stood by the double doors, watching townsfolk file in until even the standing room filled to capacity. Judge Lemuel Sipes emerged from his chambers precisely at 9 o'clock, his black robes billowing as he climbed the 3 wooden steps to the raised dais. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Sipes." The scrape of boots and rustle of skirts filled the courtroom as everyone stood. Dr. Elam Reardon adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, clutching his leather medical bag close. Beside him, Bethia Carter sat rigid in her wool dress, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap. The midwife's ledger lay sealed in oilskin on the table before her. Near the front, Reverend Clay gripped his Bible until his knuckles whitened. The altered church registry sat like an accusation on the prosecution's desk, its damaged pages marked with red ribbon. 2 deputies led Ruthie Whittaker into the courtroom through a side door. She wore a clean calico dress that hung loose on her thin frame, her wrists bound with soft leather restraints. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor as they guided her to a wooden chair. Dr. Reardon had insisted on the restraints not for safety, but to prevent her from clawing at her own arms, a habit she'd developed in the county jail. Judge Sipes settled into his chair, arranging his papers with deliberate care. The morning light through the high windows cast harsh shadows across his face as he surveyed the crowded room. His gaze lingered on Ruthie for a moment before turning to address the assembly. "We convene today," he began, his voice carrying to the farthest corner, "to hear evidence in the matter of the Commonwealth versus Jebediah Whittaker." He paused, lifting a document. "The charges before us are grave: unlawful marriage by deception, concealment of infant deaths, and," here his voice hardened, "the unspeakable corruption of natural bonds between father and child." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ruthie's shoulders hunched further, making her seem even smaller in the large chair. "Dr. Reardon," Judge Sipes called, "you will present your findings first." The physician rose slowly, gathering his papers. As he approached the witness stand, his footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Behind him, Bethia Carter's calloused fingers worried at the edge of her ledger, knowing her testimony would follow the record of that first birth she'd attended, paid for in chickens and silence. Reverend Clay leaned forward, his Bible creaking as he clutched it tighter. The morning sun caught the gold cross at his collar, the same one he'd worn when Jebediah had altered the marriage registry under his trusting eye. The judge's gavel cracked once, sharp as a gunshot in the humid air. "Proceed, doctor," he commanded, and the trial of Jebediah Whittaker began. Dr. Reardon approached the evidence table, his hands steady as he opened his medical journal. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above the worn leather binding. "I present my observations from October 13th, 1874, he began, adjusting his spectacles. "The patient, Ruthie Whittaker, displayed signs of malnourishment and physical restraint. Upon examination after her rescue, I documented multiple pregnancies, at least 4 beginning when she was." He paused, swallowing hard. "When she was barely 12 years old." The courtroom's collective intake of breath sounded like wind through winter trees. Bethia Carter's testimony followed, her voice clear despite her age. She unfolded her midwife's ledger, pointing to the entry from March 1872. 4 hens and a pouch of tobacco. That's what he paid me. The girl never spoke, just lay there with empty eyes. I knew something wasn't right, but in these hills. She twisted her hands in her lap. I carry that shame still. When the sales ledger was presented, Harlan Dent's final record, Sheriff McAteer, traced the blood-stained entry with his finger. 6 yards of calico, paid in cash, last transaction before he vanished. Reverend Clay approached next, shoulders bent as if bearing a physical weight. The altered marriage registry lay open before him, its damning evidence clear in the morning light. The original entry was for Martha Whitaker, deceased 1868. Someone, his voice cracked, someone scratched out her name and wrote Ruth W. instead. The date corresponds to Ruthie's 12th birthday. When Ruthie was called to testify, she moved like a sleepwalker to the stand. Dr. Reardon stood close by, ready with smelling salts. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Papa said I was wife now," she mumbled, staring at her hands. "Woke up with babies sometimes. They went quiet. He took them to the cave." She rocked slightly. "The other man came when Papa went to pray." The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Sipes banged his gavel for order. "Other man?" the prosecutor pressed. "Who was he, Ruthie?" But she just shook her head, retreating further into silence. Dr. Reardon cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I must note an inconsistency in my medical examination of the surviving infant. The child's eyes are distinctly hazel in color." He consulted his notes. "Neither Jebediah Whitaker nor Ruthie possessed this trait, his being blue, hers gray." The murmuring grew louder. Judge Sipes called for order again, his gavel cracked sharp as rifle fire. Rising to his full height, the judge surveyed the packed courthouse. Summer heat pressed down like a physical presence as he prepared to deliver his verdict. "Jebediah Whitaker," he intoned, "you have turned a house of God into a chamber of horrors. This was a church, a home, and a coffin, all in one." His voice hardened. "You will hang by the neck until dead on August 17th, 1875. May God have mercy on your soul." That night, as clouds gathered over Pikeville, a man in a dark coat appeared at the asylum where Ruthie was being held. The night nurse later reported he asked specifically for Mrs. Whitaker, but left no name. When she returned from fetching the administrator, he had vanished into the darkness. Dr. Harriet Bell's pen scratched across fresh paper as morning light filtered through the barred windows of her office. The brass nameplate on her desk caught the sun, casting warm reflections on the ceiling. She paused, watching her newest patient through the observation window. Ruthie Whitaker sat in the corner of the white-walled room, her thin frame curled around a crude doll fashioned from asylum bedsheets. The girl's fingers worked constantly at the doll's fabric head, smoothing and re-smoothing its features. Her lips moved in a steady rhythm. 5, 5, 5. Dr. Bell dipped her pen and began writing. "Patient assessment. R. Whitaker. Admitted. August 18th. 1875. Age. 17 years. Prior location. Pike County Jail Hospital. Physical condition. Severe malnourishment evident. Multiple pregnancy scars consistent with previous medical reports. Patient displays hunched posture and difficulty maintaining eye contact. Shows signs of extended confinement, sensitivity to direct sunlight, muscle atrophy in legs, calluses on knees suggesting prolonged kneeling, mental state, limited verbal communication, fixation on the number 5, repeats it continuously when not directly engaged, refuses separation from makeshift doll, constructed from bedding within hours of arrival, demonstrates extreme distress if doll is removed. Notable behaviors. Patient gathered loose threads from bedding immediately upon admission, fashioning crude doll before sleeping. Keeps doll hidden beneath clothing during mandatory examinations. Resists all attempts to replace it with proper toy alternatives. Initial observations. R.W. exhibits signs of severe trauma bonding and possible religious conditioning. References to Papa and the other man remain consistent with court testimony. When asked about the number 5, patient becomes agitated, clutching doll tighter and rocking. Possible connection to number of pregnancies, infants. Dr. Bell set down her pen and watched as an orderly attempted to coax Ruthie toward the dining hall. The girl shuffled forward, one hand trailing along the wall, the other pressed against her chest where the doll was hidden beneath her asylum shift. 5, Ruthie whispered, her gray eyes fixed on some distant point. 5 little ones. Dr. Bell opened the patient file from Pike County, reviewing Dr. Reardon's notes. 3 infant remains recovered from the cave. 1 living infant, now in state care. That made 4. She wrote in the margin, query source of 5, fixation, missing infant. Through the window, Ruthie had stopped walking. She pressed herself against the wall, trembling, as other patients filed past toward breakfast. Her fingers worked frantically at the doll hidden beneath her clothes. 5, she repeated, louder now. 5, 5, 5. Dr. Bell stood, straightening her starched apron, and moved toward the door. Perhaps today she could earn enough trust for answers. She had learned patience with such cases. The truth would come in its own time, like water wearing away stone. The clock on her office wall struck 9 as she opened her door. Down the hall, Ruthie's voice carried clear and insistent. 5, 5, 5. Dr. Bell's leather-bound notebook filled steadily over the autumn months. Each entry captured another piece of the fractured puzzle that was Ruthie Whittaker. The doctor's careful script documented physical evidence. Old breaks in both wrists, healed wrong, rope burns around ankles. 5 distinct sets of childbirth marks. In her 3rd-floor office, surrounded by medical texts and patient files, Dr. Bell reviewed her collected observations. October 12, 1875. Patient exhibits extreme anxiety during male staff rounds. Hides beneath bed when orderly James brings dinner tray. Screams, "Not time yet," when approached by Dr. Harrison during monthly inspection. November 3, 1875. R.W. More verbal today. Mentioned the other man, who came when Pa was gone. Claims he brought sweets and pretty things. Unable to obtain physical description or name. Patient becomes non-verbal when pressed. December 20, 1875. Reviewed visitor logs from Thistlebone area. 1870. 1874. Church attendance records, postal delivery notes, peddler routes all show minimal traffic. No regular male visitors documented. Deputy Varnes confirms isolation of property made unexpected arrivals unlikely. The winter wind rattled the asylum windows as Dr. Bell studied her most troubling entry. January 15, 1876. Unknown male visitor attempted entry through service door. Described patient by full name Ruthie Mae Whittaker. Unusual detail for outsider. Claimed to be distant relative. Left before staff could detain for questioning. Orderly, Turner noted man's careful speech. City clothes. No written description filed. Ruthie's condition deteriorated as the years passed. Her thin frame grew thinner, racked by consuming cough. The doll remained her constant companion, its fabric head worn smooth by endless worried touches. Still, she whispered 5, in the dark hours. In her final days of 1880, tuberculosis fever stripped away her careful silences. She spoke of caves and cradles, of a man who smiled and brought candies when Papa rode to town, of how Papa found out and the shouting began, of babies born in darkness. The asylum's death registry recorded her passing on November 12, 1880. Dr. Bell closed the thick file of notes and observations, preparing to archive 5 years of fragmented testimony. As she slid the papers into storage, a folded scrap fell from behind the ledger's backing board. In crude, childlike letters, barely legible. He said not to tell. The baby had 2 daddies. Dr. Bell sealed this final confession with the official records. The marriage ledger page remained missing, taken by someone who knew its worth. On Thistlebone Ridge, winter winds swept empty cabins and sealed caves, keeping their secrets. In her final entry, Dr. Bell wrote simply, "Some truths refuse to be buried, others refuse to be found." She closed the ledger on Ruthie Whittaker's story, leaving one line blank, space for a name that would never be written.